Hello, my name is Yann LeCun. I'm a professor at NYU and I'm chief AI scientist at Facebook. And today I'll be talking about energy-based models for self-supervised learning. So 2 years ago, I gave a talk at this same symposium and talked about self-supervised learning. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail today about what this is. So I see three main challenges for AI and machine learning today. And the first one is to get machines to learn with fewer labels. It's pretty clear that humans and animals can learn how the world works, mostly by observation. And we don't seem to be able to reproduce this type of learning with our machines. We rely on supervised learning and reinforcement learning, but the type of learning that takes place in humans and animals seems to not require any supervision. The second challenge is learning to reason. Machines today in deep learning are able to solve problems by basically a fixed number of steps, the layers in the neural net. And the question is how to make reasoning, which involves a variable number of steps, compatible with deep learning, gradient-based learning, essentially. And then there is a third problem, which is learning to plan complex action sequences and learning to represent them. But I really don't have any good ideas about this. I'll talk mostly about number one, a little bit about number two. So how is it that humans and animals can learn so quickly? Babies learn basic concepts about the world, mostly by observation at various times in their lives, but they accumulate an enormous amount of background knowledge about how the world works in the first few months of life. And perhaps this is the source of what we call common sense. So things like learning about gravity, learning that an object that is not supported will fall, happens around 9 months of age. And intuitive physics, takes about that long. What type of learning principles do humans and animals use to be able to learn this kind of thing? So the hypothesis that I've been formulating for a number of years is that perhaps this type of learning is what I call self-supervised learning, which is really a form of unsupervised learning. And the idea is to capture dependencies between variables by predicting a subset of variables from every other subset of variable. So let's say that we have a video that we're trying to predict the future of, right? So we are shown a few frames of a video and we ask the machine to predict the next frames of the video. There are many things that can happen in the future, and the problem is how to represent the uncertainty and the set of all possible futures that could possibly happen. But that's a form of self-supervised learning. Self-supervised learning does not necessarily mean predicting the future. It might mean predicting the past from the present. It might mean filling in the blanks wherever that occurs. But this idea of learning by prediction is very rich because there is a huge amount of information in the data that can be used, and we don't need to manually label this data. The two things that self-supervised learning can be used for, the first one, of course, is to learn representations of the world, hierarchical representations of the world, so that those representations can be used in subsequent steps to learn a particular task in supervised or reinforced mode. The second one is to learn predictive forward models of the world, which would allow a system that can produce actions to plan ahead what kind of actions to take so that a particular result will ensue. But the main question here, the main technical problem we have to solve is how to represent uncertainty and multimodality in the prediction. And for this, I'm proposing to use energy-based models. I alluded to this about 2 years ago when I gave a talk in this forum. But let me go into a little bit more detail. So an energy function, an energy-based model, is really an energy function, which is a scalar-valued function, f of x, y. X is an observed variable, and y is a variable to be predicted. And the system does not produce a y variable. It just tells you whether, when you give it an x and a y, whether those two are compatible with each other. So let's say x is an initial segment of a video. If y is a good continuation of that video, then f of x, y will take low values. And on the contrary, if y is not a good continuation of the video x, then f of x, y will take large values. This is symbolized at the bottom here in 2 dimensions, where x is a scalar value, y another scalar value, and the blue beads represents the data points. Those two energy functions here, depicted here, essentially give low energy to good samples that come from the data and higher energies to everything else. This is what's necessary when you want to use an inference algorithm that produces a good prediction y by minimizing this energy function f of xy. So let's look at this diagram here where the data points are represented by those black dots, and the energy function here, I'm depicting the lines of equal cost of this energy, equal height if you want. So the inference process would consist of starting from a point and then kind of finding a nearby point in the space that has low energy, perhaps for a fixed value of x, or perhaps not. So this is inference. We've not talked about learning yet, but how do we train an energy-based model? There are two classes of methods. There are contrastive methods, first of all, the C+1, and regularized architectural methods, which I'll talk about later. So contrastive methods consist in showing a data sample, a blue bead in this example, pushing down on its energy, so you can compute the gradient of the energy function with respect to its parameters, and you can decrease the corresponding energy. But then you also need to make sure that the energy outside of the data manifold is higher than on the data. So you pick a point, in some ways, outside the data manifold, and you push its energy up. Those are called contrastive learning, obviously, because you have those two terms, one pushing down, one pushing up. The trick is how you find those contrastive samples whose energy you're going to push up. And that's where contrastive methods become inefficient, because in a high-dimensional space, it's very difficult to push on all possible ways that a point can be outside a data manifold. So I put together this chart, which I'm not expecting you to read fully today, but for reference, most of the algorithms, learning procedures for unsupervised learning that we know belong to one of those two categories, contrastive or regularized. So things like maximum likelihood is contrastive, metric learning Siamese networks is contrastive, generative adversarial networks are contrastive, masked autoencoders are contrastive. And then regularized architectural methods are methods like sparse coding, sparse autoencoders, and variational autoencoders. So let me start with denoising autoencoders, because it's become very popular in recent years for natural language processing, for sort of pre-training natural language processing systems in a self-supervised manner. Denoising autoencoder actually originated in Pascal Vincent's publication in 2008. I had worked on this before in my PhD, but in a more restricted case. And recently, it's become extremely popular for training so-called transformer architectures to represent text in a self-supervised manner. So you take a piece of text, Y, you corrupt it in some way, and the way you corrupt a piece of text is by, for example, removing words from it or replacing words by kind of a blank marker. And then you train a neural net, a transformer architecture in this case, to basically predict the words that are missing. In the process of doing so, the system learns good representations of text because it has to be able to predict whether the word that is missing is cat or dog or car or table or a verb of some kind. So it needs to essentially understand the role of words in a text, but also the semantics. So this type of pre-training has become incredibly successful and has become in a very short time essentially the standard method for pre-training natural language processing system, and has really revolutionized NLP, as many of you probably know. So there's a key paper by Wazwani from Google presenting the transformer architecture, followed by the BERT model, which used this sort of self-supervised learning. Now, those things work really well, and you can train transformers to represent text and then use the internal representation as input to a subsequent system that does text classification or, let's say, translation. This is an example from two of my colleagues at Facebook Research in Paris who have trained a transformer to basically represent multilingual text. So half of the text is, let's say, in English, the other text in Korean, and you remove random words, and the system learns to use the text in one language to predict the words in another language. In the process of doing so, learns a language-independent representation of text, which you can then use as the basis of a translation system. Another work also by Guillaume Lample and another collaborator, François Charton, also from Facebook in Paris, has used transformers to learn to solve equations like computing an integral or solve a differential equation symbolically, which is really astonishing. And there's been other work at Facebook in dialogue systems. So this is a dialogue where a machine and a person can look at a picture and they comment on that picture and ask themselves questions. It's a little hard to figure out who is the machine and who is the person in this dialogue. The machine is actually in gray and the person in blue. But those dialogues are quite big progress compared to what was possible a few years ago. This work is more recent. This is from Nicolas Carillon, who was a resident PhD student at Facebook until recently and is now a postdoc at NYU, working with me. And he built a system that uses a convolutional net as a front end and a transformer as a back end to do end-to-end object recognition, detection, and localization. I think this is the future. So I think a lot of future vision systems will actually use a combination of convolutional nets and transformers or other ways of doing object-based inference. And this system is really interesting and works very, very well for sort of dense semantic instance segmentation and what's called panoptic semantic segmentation, which includes labeling every pixel of an image with the label of the object it belongs to. So people, of course, had the idea of using denoising autoencoders in the continuous case, for example, to learn features for images. You take an image, you blank out some parts of the image, and you train the system to recover the missing parts. Those systems do a pretty good job at reconstructing the image, but the features that are learned by those systems are not very good. If you use them as inputs to a subsequent image recognition system, they don't give you very good results. So there's been largely a failure. But what's been much more successful over the last year or so is so-called contrastive embedding method. So the idea goes a long time. I had a paper in 1993 on this topic and more in 2005, 2006, but it's been sort of made very popular in the last year or so with methods such as Perl and Moco, which came from Facebook, and SimClear, which came from Google. And the idea is you have two identical copies of the same neural net, convolutional net in this case for images. You show two images that are basically just transformations of each other. So they have the same content, and you force the system to basically produce the same outputs. You have a cost function that says the two outputs should be identical or very close to each other. And then you show a contrastive pair. Two images that are different, and then you tell the system the energy, which is the distance between the two vectors, should be large. Okay, so it's one of those contrastive methods where you push down on the energy of good samples and push up on the energy of bad samples. The problem with those methods is that they require a very, very large number of training samples, particularly negative training samples, and they require to use what's called hard negative mining to kind of choose the negative samples appropriately. But they do work, and they produce visual features that are somewhat useful. The cost functions that can be used for this all have the same characteristics, that they take the energy of the correct answer and try to push it down, and the energy of, some sort of incorrect y, if you want, called a y hat here, and try to push it up. And there's different ways of doing this, which I'm not going to go into the details of. But this is a slide that just kind of shows that maximum likelihood, when you kind of come down to it, is a type of contrastive learning that unfortunately very often runs into intractable integrals, and so you have to make approximations. The type of loss functions that are very popular for contrastive embeddings is called NCE, noise contrastive estimation, and it consists in taking a batch of samples with some positive, some negative, and then feeding their scores, their energies, into kind of a softmax that pushes the energy of the negative sample, the contrastive samples, to large values, and then pulls the good ones to small values. Now, over the last few months, there's been a couple of methods that have been proposed that don't actually require contrastive samples. And an interesting one is called BYOL, Bootstrap Your Own Latent, that came out of DeepMind. And the idea there is that you slow down the evolution of the weight of one of the two networks, so they don't have exactly the same weights anymore. And you stick a predictor on top of one of the two networks. And for some reason, this works. It's not fully explained. It's not fully understood. Even by the authors. There is some theoretical work on this to try to understand why this works, but it does work, and it produces features that actually rival the type of features you would obtain by training purely supervised on ImageNet. Another method proposed by Mathilde Caron from Facebook in Paris called Deep Cluster and SWAV use a sort of different idea, but also do not require kind of contrastive phase. So those are the two top performing systems to learn self-supervised visual features, and the performance they produce is essentially the same as what you would get by training purely supervised. Okay, so now let me talk about architectural and non-contrastive methods. And the basic idea of those methods is to limit the volume of space that can take low energy in some ways. And a good example of this is the well-known k-means algorithm, right? So k-means is a procedure that basically captures the dependency between the individual variables of a vector y that you'd like to model the distribution of. And there is a latent variable z. This latent variable is multiplied by a prototype matrix, and the reconstruction is just a product of the z vector by the prototype matrix w. The z vector is constrained to be a one-hot vector, so it's a vector with all zeros and 1, 1. And the way you compute the energy function f of y is that you take an energy function e of y z, which is a reconstruction error for a particular z, and you find the z that minimizes this reconstruction error. So you find the prototype, the column of w that is closest to the prototype y. And if you train k-means, this is a depiction here of the energy surface of k-means when you train with samples that are drawn from this ellipse data manifold here. What you get is prototypes that are equally spaced along this manifold, and you get sort of energy wells around each of those prototypes, and the overall energy is just a minimum of all of those energy wells. So a kind of a dark spot here is a minimum of the energy, and the bright spots are more like ridges or maxima. So this seems to work pretty well, but it doesn't work in high dimension. K-means is not really particularly good in high dimension. It's an example of what's called a latent variable model, where you're given observations x, and during training a desired y, and what the system has to do is find a value of z, the latent variable that minimizes this energy, and you define the new energy as the minimum over z of e of xyz, which is a more elementary energy function. The reason for using latent variable models is that it allows to make predictions in a multimodal way. So if you want to do video prediction, for example, there are several future video frames that are possible that follow an initial segment. And so you start from a variable x, and you'd like to be able to parameterize the set of possible predictions of y bar, which is depicted by this sort of S-shaped ribbon here. And what you can do is have a latent variable that can vary within a set, and as you vary the latent variable within a set, the prediction varies over this this ribbon, this sort of data manifold. Again, inference consists in, given an x and a y, finding the z that minimizes the energy, the c of y bar, the discrepancy between the prediction and the observation. But in inference mode, once you've trained the system, you don't have y, of course. So to deal with those latent variable models, there are kind of two types of methods. The methods that by construction limit the volume of space that can take low energy, like k-means, and then other methods where there is a regularizer that limits the volume of white space that can take low energy. And things like sparse coding, sparse autoencoders, and variational autoencoders belong to this category. So in general terms, a self-supervised learning system of this type would take a variable x, run it through a predictor, extract a representation from it, and then feed a latent variable z to a decoder. The latent variable would parameterize the set of possible predictions, and the possible predictions are the y bars. To limit the volume of space that can be predicted by swapping z over a set, you add a regularizer, which is a term in the energy that makes the system pay whenever z goes outside of a particular domain. And that regularizer essentially makes the system automatically give higher energy to data points or region of space you don't train it on. There are various ways to regularize this way. You can discretize z, you can minimize an L0 norm or L1 norm, or add noise to it, which is what variational autoencoders do. This is an example of a well-known algorithm called sparse modeling or sparse coding, where what you see here is a depiction of the columns of a W matrix that is multiplied by a latent vector Z, and the animation shows those filters or prototypes being learned or trained on natural image patches. So they naturally develop oriented edge detectors. And this is a well-known algorithm that is from the late 90s from Olshausen and Field. Now, the problem with this kind of decoding architecture is that you have to infer Z by minimizing a cost function. And it's much more efficient to be able to predict this the value of this variable through an encoder. So this is essentially a regularized autoencoder, where R of Z could, for example, be a L1 norm, which would make the Z sparse. So this is called using an encoder to training an encoder to predict the optimal value of a latent variable that would otherwise have to be obtained through optimization is called amortized inference. My former postdoc, Carol Greger, and I had a paper about this at ICML. And this works really well for things like learning convolutional filters and things of that type. This is another example here where the filters that are learned here are learned on CIFAR 10. They're convolutional codes, and you get very sparse representations for a particular image here. Now, variational autoencoders are a very popular method, and they can be interpreted in the context of energy-based models. And I'm going to go into the details of it, but the basic idea of how variational autoencoders limit the information content of the code is that they limit the norm of the code, and at the same time, they make the code vectors noisy, which basically limits the number of noisy spheres that you can pack in a larger sphere of minimum radius. And that's how variational autoencoders, with a kind of mechanical analogy, if you want, sort of minimize the capacity, the information capacity of the latent variable. I'm going to conclude by showing an example. I showed an early version of this 2 years ago of using conditional regularized latent variable energy-based models, in this case, a variation of variational autoencoder with amortized inference, to do video prediction to help with tasks like autonomous driving. So here we have an X, which is an initial segment of a video, goes to a predictor, and then the representation goes into a decoder, which, with the help of a latent variable, produces a prediction. The latent variable itself is regularized, and the inference of it can be amortized by training an encoder to do the right prediction. This application here that is shown is for predicting. It's for helping with autonomous driving. So we are in the blue car in the center of this image, and which is kind of a top-down view of a highway, if you will. And the system is supposed to predict what the cars around itself are going to do in the future, and that may help with planning a good strategy. This is an example of the system running where the latent variable is drawn from differently for the 4 columns on the right, and you see different futures being predicted by that system due to different drawings of the latent variable. If you don't have a latent variable, you get the second column from the left, where the predictions are very blurry because the system cannot make sort of multimodal prediction, it has to make one, and so it predicts the average. Now, why are those predictive models interesting? It's because if you have a predictive model that predicts what cars around you are going to do, or predicts what the world is going to do more generally, you can use this together with an objective function to infer, using optimal control, infer a sequence of action that will arrive at a particular result using gradient descent. It's very simple. That has been known since the 60s by control theorists. So you can do that, but you can do also is by gradient descent, you can train a neural net, P of S here, a policy network, to actually predict what the best action would be at any one time to minimize the overall cost predicted over a segment of time. And this is how you can train a car to drive itself on the highway safely, essentially, by using this kind of method. Okay, I'm going to conclude. So putting this all together, if we want to build autonomous intelligence systems, we're going to need those systems to have hardwired, built-in trainable models of the world They can predict future states, and that's going to use self-supervised learning. We're going to need critics. So critics are modules that predict the expected value of an objective in advance. We're going to need actors. So actors are like those policy networks. They given an objective and a model of the world, what is the best action I can take now to kind of minimize the objective? And the cost function is sort of instantaneous. The critic kind of predicts the future values of the cost. So there is a hypothesis here, which is a little crazy, that I've been making, which is that in the human brain and in most animal brains, there is only one model of the world. There's basically one piece in your prefrontal cortex that we can configure to model the situation at hand. But it's a single engine, if you want. And perhaps this is what attention really means. Attention of the attention of we can only do one thing at a time, essentially. And it's because we have to focus our attention on a particular problem, but we configure our model of the world for the situation at hand, and we cannot use it for anything else at the same time. So this may be a limitation, in fact, of our system. Okay, I'll conclude with a couple of conjectures. I think self-supervised learning is really the future of AI. We certainly see it with natural language processing. I think it's coming for computer vision and robotics and a number of other applications, speech recognition and things like that, multimodal systems. Models of the world are necessary, so machines will need to learn how the world works around them through SSL. Perhaps this is the type of learning from which common sense might emerge from machines if we manage to make this work properly. Reasoning is finding actions that optimize outcomes, that kind of satisfy constraints, minimize costs, and so I think we can view reasoning in the context of energy-based models as just energy minimization, essentially. And perhaps a crazy hypothesis is that consciousness is the deliberate configuration of a world model, so that it views solves the situation at hand. I'd like to conclude by saying that there is no such thing as artificial general intelligence, although the phrase is very popular currently within the field. Intelligence is always specialized. Human intelligence is very specialized. And so I don't think we should talk about general intelligence. We should talk about human-level intelligence, so perhaps before that, rat-level or cat-level intelligence. And perhaps we'll see this in the context of a lifetime. Thank you very much.